I'm Steve McCarthy. Welcome back to Freedom Is Not Free. For as many stories and positions there are in the military, you'd think that we'd go through all of them by this, our now 70th show, or close to our 70th show. My next guest, though, once again shows that there are always new specialties and new experiences to examine. Jan Janssen, a son of the Midwest, I think is fair to say, with Nebraska, is agreed to come on and spend some time with us and talk about his military experience. Jan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Steve.
As I mentioned in my intro, you're a son of the Middle West, and Nebraska specifically. You mentioned off camera that you had some experiences in World War II that kind of shaped where you wanted to go with the rest of your life.
My decisions, yeah. I grew up on a farm near Hastings, Nebraska, and in 1942, the Navy selected Hastings to build their naval ammunition depot. They wanted a spot that was at least 1,000 miles from any ocean. They wanted a spot that would serve major railways. There were 3 major railways that came through Hastings. And at that time, they had the only 2 transcontinental highways in the United States, Highway 6 and Highway 281. I grew up about a mile from the southern edge of that naval ammunition depot. I had 2 uncles that served in World War II. And so there was always a presence about the military there. Some things that a lot of people don't realize, I think, about Nebraska. At that time, their population was about 1.3 million, and they had over 140,000 that served in World War II. That was roughly 1 out of every 5 men in the state of Nebraska serving in the military. There were a lot of air depots and training grounds. There were bomber plants. Martin Bomber was outside of Omaha, and they actually built the Enola Gay, which dropped the bomb on Hiroshima, and they also built the Boxcar, which dropped the bomb on Nagasaki. So I had World War II really kind of influenced me, and so I was kind of bent towards that.
So you really grew up in an environment of not only patriotism, but service was not a something to be shirked. Service was a responsibility drilled into you.
Major scrap drives during Nebraska was at the forefront of that, and they collected like over 120 pounds of scrap per resident of the state. And it was just things like that that do it. And I don't remember the attack on Pearl Harbor, but in 1944, September, they had an explosion at the Naval Ammunition Depot, which killed 9 people, injured 53, created a crater over 500 feet long, and was heard over 100 miles away. It broke most of the windows in our house, and I remember my bed, which was close to the window, was covered in glass. It happened at 9 o'clock in the morning, so by that time on the farm, you were already up.
And you mentioned also that although your dad wanted you to follow in his footsteps as a farmer, you had no interest in farming.
Yeah, I used to sit out there on the tractor and watch the trains go by on the track and wonder what they were going to see that day and where they'd be the next day. And I just always had kind of a wanderlust. And farming, milking cows at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening wasn't exactly. It's kind of interesting. 2 days after I went in the service, my dad sold all the milk cows and never milked again.
So, with that kind of background, certainly hard rock, middle class America, growing up around, as you said, a major naval installation, you then joined the Air Force.
Well, I knew I didn't want to go in the Army and be in the infantry. I couldn't swim, so that kind of excluded the Navy. And the Air Force was a separate service at this time, and I had always had a hankering to fly. I worked for a lumber company in my senior year, and the owner had a plane, and we used to go out and fly light plane and chase coyotes out of marshes and things like that. So I thought, well, maybe I had a good chance. So I convinced my dad. I had skipped a grade in country school, and so when I graduated from high school, I had just turned 17. So my parents had to sign the papers, and the night I graduated from high school, I was on the train at 1 o'clock in the morning, heading for basic training in San Antonio.
Now, was this the first time that you had left Nebraska?
We had relatives that lived in Illinois, but other than trips to visit them, and I think I had gone to the Black Hills once, but otherwise, no, you didn't have a lot of money for travel and entertainment and things like that.
Now, at 17, you were probably one of the youngest people in your basic training unit,
I was,
and your first time really away from home on your own.
right?
Share with us a couple of your memories of what basic training was like in the Air Force.
Well, one of the memories that really is kind of seared in is on the train ride down, I had never encountered toilets and water fountains for blacks and whites. And I remember seeing that in the train depots in Texas, and found that strange. And then in basic, we had a number of people from the South, and I remember one individual who staunchly believed that because his grandfather had owned slaves, that was an entitlement for him to own slaves if he wanted to. So that was thinking that I did not grow up around and was a little strange. But, you know, there weren't any fights over it or anything like that, but I just found it a strange way for people to look at the blacks who were some of my best buddies in the service ended up being blacks also.
And really, at this time, integration within the armed forces was in its infancy.
Yes.
There was
To a
taking
certain
baby steps.
To a certain extent it was.
Okay, you successfully get through your basic training in San Antonio.
Well, first I mentioned I wanted to go in and try and fly. Well, the medical exam in the service showed I was partially colorblind, so that eliminated that. So I had worked at a state hospital and thought, well, then maybe the medics was kind of plan B. And that was kind of the direction we were going. Halfway through basic, a number of us were invited to a theater, and a major gave a presentation on foreign language training. Well, I didn't really like English when I was in high school, and so I thought, nah, not something I'm interested in. So at the end of his talk, he wanted to know how many people would like to volunteer for something like this. And about half of the people raised their hand. I wasn't one of them. So then I discovered the term needs of the Air Force. The major says, well, I guess that makes the rest of you non-volunteers because we have quotas to fill, and so you're all going to be going for preliminary language training.
So you had no choice, basically, what you were going to do in the Air Force. You were
At that time,
volunteered to become a linguist. And in fact, you went for training as a Russian linguist.
correct.
Were you given an opportunity to at least select a language?
That was pretty well, that was the one that sounded most interesting of the ones. And the language training at that time was at Monterey, which was the Army school, and at Syracuse University, which was the Air Force Institute of Technology. And so my predisposition was to go with the Air Force and go to Syracuse University. It was a 6-month basic course that was taught by native Russians. We got a tremendous insight into their culture, and we even had a choir, and I mean, it was a total immersion because that's all you studied for 8 hours a day and then another 3 to 4 hours of study every night.
Now, I would imagine the attrition rate in that school was pretty high.
It was. Actually, the attrition took place. They sent us to Kelly Air Force Base for a pre-language training, and that was in 6 weeks. And I would say about half of the people dropped out of there. Now, again, I probably would have been close to that because a good friend and I decided we weren't really sure about this language training, but the ones that dropped out early got sent to either Air Police School or cooks and bakers. And that wasn't what we wanted, so we thought if we could kind of ease out. And I remember starting the 5th week, well, our average was about 79, and The colonel came in and said, well, I have some good news and some bad news. He said, bad news is we're losing a few too many people. The good news is we've lowered the passing grade to 75. So it was kind of a foregone conclusion then that I was going to be going for language training.
So at this stage, you had made up your mind you were going to graduate, be a linguist. Did you, while you were in this training, know what you were going to do subsequent to graduation? Did you have an inkling? Or?
We had an inkling because we had to fill out a many-page questionnaire, and they did a background investigation on us, and a few people left the program because of that. They couldn't pass the security clearance. And I remember going home at Christmas time, and an elderly gentleman in the church approached me and wanted to talk to me, and he said, I don't know what you're involved with, but he said, the FBI was out to talk to me last week, and he said, I told them you were a pretty good kid.
So
I just kind of smiled.
So they were after you as far as doing deep background checks for security clearances.
Absolutely.
And in subsequently graduating from language school, you went into the signals intercept business.
Right. I then decided that I would probably like to be a transcriber. I was a good typist, and so that was one of the qualifications they wanted. So they sent me back to Kelly for a 6-week class in transcribing, and that then essentially became my full-time job when I went overseas to Germany.
Within the boundaries of any lingering security requirements, explain what a Russian transcriber, what was your duty day like?
Well, I think all of this has been declassified at this point. We had voice intercept specialists that were monitoring the airwaves, both HF and UHF, and would record the air defense forces in the Soviet Union. And we would then take those tapes and transcribe them, and all it was done on 6-ply paper, typing with a Cyrillic typewriter, and that was all sent to NSA for evaluation and use in our security services. Occasionally, we had flights that would penetrate the boundaries of the Soviet Union to see how fast they would scramble their aircraft and copy the transmissions, and it was just a way of keeping pace on what they were doing.
Now, this is a kind of work that easily could become rote. How did you keep yourself sharp from day to day?
Well, again, I had a pretty good ear for the language and being a good typist, and so there was always something different. And we even read some Soviet newspapers just to glean information that we might think might be useful. And so some of it was quite interesting. I can remember after the Russians had come out with their Zeal automobile, and they had challenged the international community to an international race, 24-hour endurance race. Ford was the only company that took them up on the challenge, which was going to be held outside of Moscow. I think Ford lapped them 4 or 5 times in the race, but the next day Pravda, which means truth, said there was an international auto race yesterday, and the Soviet Union entry finished second, and the American entry came in next to last.
So the magic world of Soviet propaganda.
It was. And I was in Bremerhaven at the time Sputnik was launched. I mean, every about 90 minutes, you heard that beep, 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 and really wondered what was going on. I was during the time when the revolution started in Hungary, and the Hungarians were begging us to come in and help them. And Eisenhower wisely resisted doing that because that probably would have started World War III.
And over the course of your career, as you mentioned, the Hungarian uprising, we had the Berlin crisis, the Czechoslovakian summer, all these numerous events that you were listening in on. Did you ever find it difficult, again, because of the security requirements? You couldn't talk about any of this.
No, That was difficult. It made family life difficult because you could not talk with your family about anything you were doing, and I really don't think they had much of an idea of what we were doing.
Now, during your career, not only did you have opportunity for extensive military training, but you also went to Penn State undergraduate, got your undergraduate degree, and then an MBA from USC.
Right.
Talk to us about how you earned those opportunities.
Well, after 4 years, I had decided I was going to get out and go to school at Kansas State. I went a couple of years there, had 2 children, and having to work almost full-time as well. And I just didn't feel I was getting as much out of school as I should. And a good buddy wrote me and told me about the Airman's Education and Commissioning Program that the Air Force had started. So I looked into it and decided I could probably qualify for that. So I decided to go back in, re-enlist, and apply for it. If I didn't get accepted, I would do a year of night school, and then I could finish up in a year when I got out. Long story short, I went to intermediate training in Russian language at Syracuse University, and then was sent to Wakkanai, Japan, a remote tour 25 miles from Sakhalin Island.
Now, just to interrupt you for a second, a remote tour is tour without family.
Right.
Ordinarily a year to 13 months.
Yeah. Well, Wakkanai was a lovely place. Average snowfall, 235 inches a year. Softball season was about 2 days long. So.
Well, I've heard of a lot of places, Jan, but I'll tell you, I've never even heard of that one, so, I'll take you, it sounds real isolated.
Yeah, it was beautiful.
Talk a little bit now, of course, that year you separated from your family. The demands of secrecy within your job. How do you maintain family cohesion and still do that?
At that time, it was difficult. We didn't have the internet and some of the things that they have in being able to keep in communication with your family today. Occasionally, if the weather conditions were right, we might get a Mars call that you could go from station to station and was essentially a telephone call, but that was usually limited to 2 or 3 minutes. And so I was glad to leave there. I had just been relieved from duty. I applied for AACP and was told I was going to Penn State to get a degree in aerospace engineering. I had been relieved from duty and the Cuban Missile Crisis hit. I was immediately called back on and put in charge of a guard detail, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, even though we were many, many thousands of miles removed from there. But it was just, they didn't know what was going to happen. And again, this was a very secure installation. Finally, that was put to rest by Kennedy and his advisors, and so I came back and went to Penn State. They were on the quarter system, so I did 9 quarters there, and then once I graduated from Penn State, was sent to officer training school to be commissioned.
Now, officers training school, when you go in immediately without a lot of prior service, can be a challenge. What kind of challenge was it? You had a number of years in the Air Force. Now they're going to send you to be an officer.
Yeah, they really put the pressure on you. You have 2 periods. You have a 6-week period where you're the underclass, and then a 6-week period where you're the upper class. And they put a lot of pressure on because they want people with good qualifications to serve in the officer corps. And so they try and put a lot of pressure on to see whether you can take a lot of harassment and things like that. I just decided there was no way they were going to be able to dish out anything that I couldn't take. And then the second half, I was the executive officer. We had 2 different locations down at San Antonio and Medina and Lackland, and the commander for the upper class came from the opposite end. So as I was the executive, the leading candidate from Medina. And then fortunately, the commander was one of the distinguished graduates, so I got to lead the graduation parade, the troops, and that was kind of, my family got to come down and experience that, and that was a...
That's a neat way to transition
Yeah.
from NCO to officer. What do you think that, as a Mustang and in the military, a Mustang is an officer who had previous experience within the enlisted and NCO ranks. As a new officer and a Mustang, what was the challenges that were special to that category, do you think?
We were older than most second lieutenants and first lieutenants, but we had a lot more experience. And about that time, the Vietnam War was cranking up, and then I thought, because of my background in languages, especially Russian, and my aerospace engineering degree, I would be going to the Foreign Technology Division at Wright-Patterson, because it seemed like a perfect marrying of the two disciplines. But again, these are the Air Force. Vietnam was cranking up, so anybody who knew anything about aircraft maintenance became an aircraft maintenance officer. So I was sent to Stewart Air Force Base, and that was probably the best training I ever had in terms of management. I had a hodgepodge of aircraft, 4 C-54s that supported the Duline run, 13 T-33s that the 36th Air Division used to get their flying time in jet aircraft, C-131 that supported the Commandant at West Point, C-117 that flew the cadets at West Point, various activities, and I mean, so it was a real management challenge. And I had a chief master sergeant at the time who taught me more about management than I probably could have ever learned from anybody else. It was really a neat experience.
You just sent me right back in my memory when you mentioned Stewart Air Force Base. I lived there many years later, only it was Stewart Army Subpost.
Right.
The Air Force had vacated and kindly given their quarters to us. What was your favorite assignment? And what was well, I think I can name the assignment you liked least, but
Yeah.
what was your favorite assignment?
Obviously, my last one, where I worked at Aeronautical Systems Division and went there and wrote the position paper that started the Simulator System Program Office, changed the way the Air Force trains their pilots. It's extended the life of many of the aircraft many, many years, because the amount of flying time was reduced by the amount of simulator time they had. In a simulator, you don't have safety implications. You don't have an aircraft at risk. You don't have all the extended maintenance. The cost per flying hour for an interjet aircraft probably something over $2,000 an hour. It can be done in a simulator for less than $200 an hour. So tremendous savings there. That eventually spread to where we had simulators for the other services. Interestingly enough, Strategic Air Command was one of the last ones to sign on. They used to take B-52s up with and fly them just for training, and it took us quite a while to convince them that they could do a lot of that same training in partial mission simulators. We didn't have a full mission simulator, but you could do it in partial mission simulators. And that's extended the life of the B-52 probably by 20 years.
So that was the kind of assignment where not only did you get a lot of personal gratitude,
Yes.
not gratitude, but personal enjoyment out of, but also a contribution in the military that extended after you left.
Yes.
And that's kind of a unique combination. What would you say the thing that, what's the one thing you learned during your Air Force career that carried over into civilian life that made you a success?
I think the management skills. I mean, it really drove it home. I had more responsible jobs in the Air Force than I ever did in my civilian career after I got out. And I spent over 10 years in aerospace and another 5 years doing consulting for the Defense Department or the Justice Department on aerospace fraud cases. That was also very interesting work, but it was the ability to manage things. One of my first, I went to work for Rockwell International on the B-1A, and then after President Carter canceled that program, Hughes Aircraft was going to be doing a competitive development on the medium-range air-to-air missile. And so they wanted me to manage the warhead and some of the explosives and also heat exchangers. And I just, again, the management, the experience that I had paid off so much there that it allowed Hughes to win the competition. And in fact, it was the first 2 test missiles we had that fired at a drone, and this was an active radar missile, so your chances of hitting the drone are about 1 out of 4. And both of the first two test missiles were direct hits. So we knew we had something special. I can remember the euphoria among the engineers at that time. It was really outstanding.
And again, working on systems that will not only make a contribution to the defense, but it's almost a feeling of legacy that, I've done my part. Air Force, like all its services, has changed over the years since we retired, and the requirements of service have changed a lot. The deployments are rapid. The impact on families is great.
Yes.
Given all that, would you recommend a military career or military service to your grandchildren?
Yes, absolutely. I believe military service, especially for young men and even for a lot of young ladies today, can be very, very rewarding. It gives you the opportunity to mature and find out who you really are. And you get some opportunities in the military that would take you many, many years in civilian life before you would be given an equivalent level of responsibility.
And again, throughout your career, we've both seen where military service was out of favor for a while, at the very least, too.
Yeah.
Now it's become trendy to ask or to thank people for their service. Do you think, given your Midwestern roots, is this country more patriotic now or less patriotic?
Oh, I think it's definitely less patriotic. I mean, it was a real struggle during the war. I mean, like I said, you didn't have money to do much of anything except maintain your equipment and hope the weather cooperated and that you got a decent crop. As I said, I recognized early on that wasn't a life that I particularly wanted. There were a lot of other people that did. Being the only son, I know my father expected me to do that because that's what he had done and his father had done. But it just wasn't in my blood. There was some wanderlust in there, and I'm really glad that I made the decisions I did. I came to several whys in the road, and why you choose a certain route is always interesting to look back on. And I told my grandchildren and great-grandchildren, there's not much I would change. If you get an opportunity to do something big, go for it. You will find out that that's where the rewards come.
And that's one of the things that I try to drive home, especially with professional career personnel, that there are unlimited opportunities within the service. You just have to look for them. One of the reasons we do this show is a legacy to children and grandchildren of veterans, that stories don't disappear. And I want to commend Jan, because he brought this in. He's already beat us to the punch. He put together a little booklet called My Story for his grandchildren.
And great-grandchildren.
And great-grandchildren. You don't look old enough, Jan, for great-grandchildren. But these kind of things are important to families. History is history. personal stories fill in the colors of that history and make it alive and make it important. So I thought this was important to show on camera, and Jan, again, congratulations on having the foresight to do that.
Thank you. Well, that was at the urging of my wife over many years, so.
Wives are always wiser.
They are, aren't they?
Thanks for coming in and spending some time with us. Thanks for your service.
Thank you, Steve. It's been a
Thank you.
pleasure.
For SCA TV, I'm Steve McCarthy.